In graph 19.1, we illustrated how we can determine the economic incidence of a per unit tax. We'll now see that economic incidence depends a lot on the relative elasticities of demand and supply. We'll begin with the case where demand is relatively more price inelastic than supply. Suppose a per unit tax T then leads to the new equilibrium quantity Xt, where the price that producers receive can be read off of the supply curve as Ps. The consumer price Pd is then read off of the demand curve at the equilibrium quantity Xt. The difference between the producer price Ps and the consumer price Pd emerges from the per unit tax T. And the new equilibrium quantity Xt emerges from the insertion of a tax wedge equal to the per unit tax T between the demand and the supply curves to the left of the original equilibrium. In panel B, we'll repeat the same analysis for the case where the supply curve is relatively more price inelastic than the demand curve. At the new equilibrium quantity Xt that results from the imposition of the per unit tax, the producer's price can be read off of the supply curve as Ps, and the consumer price can be read off the demand curve as Pd. The difference between the consumer price and the producer price then again emerges because of the imposition of the per unit tax T. The tax wedge equal to the size of the per unit tax in panel B is the same size as the one used in panel A. The difference is the relative price inelasticities between demand and supply. In panel A, consumers were relatively price unresponsive, and thus their price increases by a lot, whereas the producer's price doesn't change by much. In panel B, on the other hand, it's producers who are relatively price unresponsive. Thus, their price falls by a lot, whereas consumer price increases only by a little. The burden of a tax will therefore tend to be shifted towards that side of the market that is less price responsive. This should make intuitive sense. If it's pretty easy to shift the burden of the tax to consumers because they don't respond much to price, then much of the tax will simply be passed on to them regardless of how the law is written. Similarly, if producers are not very price responsive, the bulk of the tax burden will be shifted to them. Notice that this analysis here does not rely on any particular assumption about underlying consumer tastes. We've made no appeal to consumer surplus, and therefore haven't had to talk about whether we think the underlying individual tastes are quasi-linear and whether we can use the market demand curve as a marginal willingness to pay curve. The analysis therefore applies to all types of tastes for consumers whose individual demand curves make up the market demand.